Who is Odysseus? I mean, who is he really? And where did he come from? I'm not talking about his backstory. I'll cover that in the next video. Rather, I'm referring to the cultural roots and inspirations behind the character as we find him in the Odyssey. So this is a video about the origins of Odysseus. I'm going to look through various sources and theories and then come up with what I think is a possible to likely account of how the character of Odysseus might have evolved. This is all speculative. So as we go, jump in with your own thoughts and views in the comments. Welcome to Ancient Classics. Let's start with a key question. Was Odysseus a character invented for the Homeric epics, just as the Iliad and the Odyssey were reaching their mature form? Or is Odysseus a much older character than that? If he is older, when and how did he arise? And was Odysseus' character a long-standing, authentic, fully integrated person, or a composite of different sources taken from here, there, and everywhere? Now, these questions are unanswerable, for we lack the historical record or literary tradition predating the Homeric epics themselves, but we can have some fun and take a guess. First, Odysseus' name, nomen omen and all that. There are many variant spellings of Odysseus' name, examples of which can be found quite far back in the archaeological record. Now, Odysseus' name does not come up in the 2nd millennium BCE Linear B texts, though his name's spelling, with an epsilon, upsilon, sigma, suggests it comes from an older stratum of characters. His name, where we do see it in the early written record, some with a lambda, L, rather than a delta, D, such as Odyssey or Odysseus, variants which are found on vases as far back as the 7th century BCE, and some have argued that variants with a lambda was actually the original form of the name. Now, that variant, Odyssey or Odysseus, sounds very similar to me to the Latin name by which our hero is known, Ulysses or Ulysses. So one key question is whether Odysseus with a delta D and Ulysses are and always were the same character, the distinctions merely being ones of spelling and pronunciation, with the latter form somehow becoming more prominent in the Latin language, perhaps as transmitted via the Greek settlers in Italy and the Etruscans. Or alternatively, were Odysseus and Ulysses two separate characters who subsequently became associated with each other? Personally, I find the idea of two characters a little less likely. Either which way, in the manuscript tradition and other surviving papyrus scraps of Homer, and indeed in other Greek literature, the name Odysseus with a delta D is preeminent and does not seem to have been supplanted at any point. To me, this suggests that the character had sufficient history in the oral tradition, whether epic or otherwise, to produce several quite significant variants before the written text of the Odyssey predominated. All this suggests to me that Odysseus was not invented for the purposes of the Homeric epics in their mature form. Rather, the character had been floating around for some time in the folklore and traditions. So perhaps we can write off the idea that Odysseus was an entirely new character created for the mature Homeric epics. And what about the etymology of his name? Linguistic etymologies, I mean here, rather than patronymics. We have to be careful here. Cute though it may sound, we can't necessarily draw any conclusions about the roots of a character from his name alone. That's just dumb, though some people do try to do that. There are indeed several examples of puns upon Odysseus' name in the Odyssey, wherein his name is linked to the verb odyssamai, I become angry with or I hate, a sometimes pitying pun cited when the gods are giving Odysseus shit. In Book 19, Odysseus describes how his name was given to him by his maternal grandfather Autolykos, who said to Odysseus' parents, "Son-in-law and daughter, name him just as I say, for I am the source of hatred, Odyssamenos, for many men and women upon this fertile earth. And so, let his name be Odysseus." Now, personally, I don't put much in store by such etymologies. They feel more like retrospective puns rather than any clues to the character's cultural origins. Incidentally, if we are to take the view that Odysseus and Ulysses were already existing variant forms, then one reason why Homer might have opted for the Odysseus variant may have been to make use of the potential Odyssey pun, as indeed suggested by Stanford. But the fact that this name was given to Odysseus by his maternal grandpa, Autolykos, is perhaps significant. Like grandfather, like grandson. Autolykos could give us a hint at the folkloric roots of Odysseus. Now, it is something of a cliché, although not one without truth, that Odysseus embodies many of the features of the classic folkloric trickster character. Tricksters come up in all kinds of folk traditions, and I think it'd be dumb to try to link the tricksters from different traditions across the world together, as if they all evolved from a single proto-trickster figure. Rather, I'm guessing that their similarities are more a question of a shared set of characteristics that express themselves and emerge naturally across humanity. But Odysseus' grandpa, Autolykos, himself falls within the trickster/dodgy dealer trope. And so perhaps he was to some extent a more direct influence on the formation of the mature Odysseus' character. Autolykos' very name is Sus, the wolf himself, but there are few surviving sources for this character from archaic Greek literature. There's the Odyssey source I quoted, and in the Iliad, when Odysseus dons his famous boar-tusked helmet, Homer tells us that the cap had been stolen by Autolykos after breaking into some guy's house, though to be fair the text is muddled, and it's not even clear that this Autolykos is necessarily Odysseus' grandpa. Odysseus doesn't even inherit the helmet directly from him. In the Hesiodic Catalogue of women, Autolykos is described as the child of the god Hermes. Hermes, especially as presented in the Homeric hymn, is a trickster figure himself, a thief amongst gods. Perhaps not uncoincidentally, the Homeric hymn to Hermes, in which Hermes, among other things, steals cattle, uses similar epithets and language to describe Hermes as Homer does for Odysseus. Indeed, in his commentary on the Homeric hymn to Hermes, Vergadas notes, "The association between Hermes and Odysseus is deeply rooted in archaic Greek thought. Both characters embody the quality of metis, wit or wiles, which they use against the beer strength of their stronger opponents. Both are expert liars and have a special relationship to the poet. Hermes and Odysseus share some traditional epithets, polytropos, polymetis, and poikilometis. So there does seem to be some kind of cultic or folkloric trickster or outright thief vibe running through from Hermes to his son Autolykos and then to his grandson Odysseus. Now, this lineage may well have been retrospectively constructed once the character of Odysseus had already taken root. And in that regard, I find the fact that Autolykos is named as Odysseus' maternal grandfather quite compelling, but not in any kind of dumbass, overly literal, oh, Odysseus might have inherited the trickster gene from his grandpa kind of way. Rather, if the character of Odysseus was in some sense shaped by or borrowed from figures like Autolykos, it makes sense that a poet would make him the grandson. And the maternal line actually helps here. In a patriarchal tradition, the patrilineal ancestry is more fixed, leaving more room on the mother's side for indirect or borrowed influences to be introduced later. Now, if we're going to talk about the origins of Odysseus, we do need to at least touch upon the possibility that Odysseus, the literary mythological character, may have been based on an historical person or persons, whether or not an actual king or big man of Ithaca. Absent hard evidence, I find that kind of thing a bit lame and too speculative, even for my lightweight modus operandi. There's really nothing to pin any such derivations on, though that hasn't stopped some people trying. Stanford helpfully summarizes and dismisses them thus. Obviously, the primeval Ulysses may have been a historical person, a prince of Ithaca endowed with unusual mental ability and renowned for his adventurous sea voyages, or else an Egyptian trader or a captain in some Minoan fleet. But in fact, there is no genuine documentary evidence for the prototypical Ulysses outside Homer. Until there is, it will remain impossible to determine precisely what is fact and what fiction in the Homeric poems. Now, are we to associate Odysseus with any particular region? I mean, yeah, sure, all literary sources have him as coming from Ithaca, but did the stories of Odysseus originate or come to prominence in any particular region of Greece? There's some speculation about a Boeotian provenance. I found a crusty old book from 1914 by J.A.K. Thompson. in which this was argued, mostly from Odysseus' associations with Autolykos and Tiresias in the underworld Nicaea scene of the Odyssey. But I didn't quite follow and I lost patience with all that. It feels too fragmentary to me. And even if the Nicaean scene has Boeotian affinities, that feels to me more like a borrowed episode rather than an integral originating part of Odysseus and who he is. This actually brings us on to the next point, the source of all the random secondary stories in the Odyssey. So one thing to consider is whether those stories associated with Odysseus, if not necessarily the character himself, might have origins in or at least have been influenced by external traditions, Near Eastern mythologies and myths, of the kind which may have been transmitted from the East to Greece through trade and other cultural exchanges. Such borrowing and influences are the theme of M.L. West's monumental East Face of Helicon. And at this point, to cite a massive cliché, we come to the possible influence of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, echoes of Gilgamesh's character can be seen perhaps more clearly in Achilles rather than Odysseus, though the subject matter of many of Gilgamesh's adventures seem to have their echoes in the wanderings of Odysseus, journeys to far-off lands, to the land of the dead, and so on. Even so, at this level of generality, it is near impossible, in my view, to distinguish actual influences and borrowings from expressions of the kind of natural tropes that tend to arise organically and are reinvented from time to time in creative culture, folk tales, literary and commercial alike. So, here we come more clearly to the matter of Odysseus' mystical adventures, which, as I discussed in my previous video, are primarily limited to 4 of the 24 books in the Odyssey, in the guise of Odysseus' quite possibly bullshit story to the Phaeacians, and quite apart from the more realist human frame of the bulk of the Odyssey, and indeed the Iliad. Thematically, they feel like some kind of insertion into the larger epic, which is broadly a more psychological, cultural drama about a homecoming and the reassertion of identity and masculinity into a society, the so-called returning husband trope. Many homecoming stories, or nostoi, grew up around the Trojan War cycle, of which the Odyssey is just the longest and most detailed variant, one to which perhaps many other random tropes attached themselves. Here I'm kind of moving away from the subject of the origins and construction of the hero Odysseus to the origins and construction of the epic of the Odyssey as a whole, though I think the two, the origins and development of a hero and of his eponymous epic, are inextricably interlinked. The key question is the extent to which the various mythical stories that were perhaps thus integrated into the tale of the homecoming of Odysseus were already associated with the character of Odysseus, or whether an already existing but simpler kind of Odysseus, perhaps the hero already fleshed out in the Iliad, took on some of the characteristics of now-lost heroes who were more directly associated with crazy tales of cyclopes, sirens, journeys to the underworld and all that. Perhaps it was a bit of both. Perhaps the character of Odysseus was already known as a man of wit and trickery, and therefore tales relating to cunning heroes of various kinds naturally gravitated themselves towards Odysseus's major homecoming epic, or, if we are to envisage the Odyssey in its mature form being primarily the work of a single poet, perhaps that poet, seeking to flesh out his extra-large homecoming epic to match the size of the Iliad, mined other sources associated with cunning heroes. If that were the case, a cunning Iliadic Odysseus may have grown into the more universal cheeky trickster figure through such natural or forced accretion of other poems and heroes. Now, whilst fully acknowledging that we really can't be sure of anything, I think that my take, after reading into this and trying to put something together, goes something like this. Whether there was a historical Ithacan big man called Odysseus or Ulysses, and whether he fought in the conflict at the site of the historical Troy, I neither know nor care too much. But I reckon it was likely that there was a character of that name, known for his cunning and by no means a weakling, a martial hero nonetheless. And he'd probably been floating around the tradition for ages, long before the Homeric epics were put into writing. His name has an archaic ring after all. with its epsilon upsilon sigma ending. This character was one of the main or second-tier level heroes who routinely featured in the oral epic poetic tradition associated with Troy. At this time, we're talking here perhaps the 8th to 7th centuries. Just as the Iliad was reaching its mature state, several spellings or forms of this guy's name were floating around. Some spelt with a delta, Odysseus, others with a lambda, Odysseus or Olyxes. There was also at the time many Troy-themed oral epics circulating throughout the cultural milieu of the Hellenes or Greek speakers, whoever they were. There were so many tales, some about the war itself, some about various heroes' adventures before, during and after the war, including many homecoming tales. Presumably, each epic performance could only have lasted a couple of hours at most, like the length of a movie, and each performance would only have dealt with a very few of these elements. But from this tradition, something unique, a long-form epic focusing on a few days at Troy began to take shape, perhaps prompted by the recent adoption of writing by the Greeks. This epic was the Iliad. Once the long-form Iliad took shape, other poets in the tradition started developing their own long-form literary epics too, the epic cycle, most of which has been lost. It made sense to one poet, or a group of poets, to lean in hard to one of the homecoming tales of one of the heroes, a contrast to the static claustrophobia and combat-based Iliad. Many heroes had their homecomings, but Odysseus seemed like an interesting character to focus on. He was already popular from the Iliad, but the Iliad had never featured his most famous wartime operation, the Trojan horse. Odysseus seemed to be the perfect candidate for a long-form, peacetime tale of return, featuring, indeed, the Trojan horse as an inset narrative. But our poet, the one who was writing the proto-long-form Odyssey, and at this stage, perhaps he was actually writing, well, he needed extra material to integrate into his epic, if it was to match the Iliad in its scale and grandeur. Odysseus was already well known for his stratagems, tricks, cunnings, and his charisma, so it was natural that in looking for extra material, the poet would mine other themes, trickster or cheeky-chappy stories that were floating around in the tradition, perhaps indeed inspired from exotic tales taken from outside the Greek tradition. And so, as the epic grew in its construction, so did its hero. Odysseus, therefore, in this new epic, began to take on some of the traits of the heroes of the stories which had been attached to him. Meanwhile, leaning hard into the concept of Odysseus as the source of the god's wrath, our punning poet made use of the Odyssey pun, opting to favour the spelling Odysseus with a delta, which, with the popularity of this newly forged Odyssey, became the canonical, indeed the only mainstream spelling of his name in Greek. Even so, alternative spellings clung on in the margins, surviving into non-Greek borrowings such as Ulysses, so that when hundreds of years later the Romans began seriously to engage with the Homeric tradition, the name Ulysses or Ulixes was the default Latin name for this character. But hey, we'll just never know. What I came up with was just one possible story, perhaps too heavily influenced by M.L. West's take in his making of the Odyssey. Ask me another time, and I might come up with something completely different. But what are your takes? Did Odysseus emerge fully formed in the act of artistic creation, or did he grow through the epic tradition as an intrinsic part of it? Was he a character borrowed from a parallel Greek folklore, planted into the Trojan War stories, adapting to the context and causing the stories to adapt around him? Was he a character born from some other culture's folklore or mythology entirely? Or rather was he a composite, a mishmash, taken from all kinds of tropes and types, out of which a unique new figure was formed? What do you think? Let us know in the comments. And meantime, like and subscribe, and we'll be back soon with more Odyssey adjacent takes.